Okay. Today what we're up to is replacing both rear springs on a 2010 Volvo V70. Symptoms were quite clear. Pulled out of a drive and heard a big giant clonk in the rear end, and then got home and stepped back and took a look at the rear end, and one side was lower than the other. So I've replaced one already, so hopefully this one will go just as smoothly. Basically, this is the spring setup in the 2010 V70. As you can see, there's no, the shocks are unrelated to the springs. The springs sit in the lower control arm, so it's really just a matter of unbolting the top bolt of the sway bar link, and then taking the bolt out of the spindle. And if you put a jack under the control arm and carefully lower it, there's no need to use spring compressors. The spring comes right out. So that's what we'll be up to next. There have been a lot of questions around how to properly jack up, or what jack points there are for the P3 Volvo, in my case 2010. So what I've done to jack up the rear end nice and high is before putting the jack in, I basically put some 2x6s on the ground, which, well, obviously gives you a little bit more lift with your standard jack. And then it's a matter of, again, putting 2x6s under the car. And where I've jacked the car up is on a pretty significant piece of steel that's presumably part of the frame down here. So I'm able to get that nice and high. And for this job, you want to be getting the rear end of the car as high as possible so that you can take the spring out without any issues. Of note, the nut on this lower control arm is welded right in, so you don't want to be using the traditional method, which is to hold on to the bolt head and take the nut out. I learned that the hard way when I was messing with the shocks a few years back. The nuts are welded in. All you got to do is take a socket to the bolt and take it right out. We're ready to start with taking the sway bar link off the sway bar. That'll allow us to lower the lower control arm as much as possible. The sway bar link is 13mm socket. I'm going to use a long socket. Need a counter hole. 13. Oops. Sort of not the way to do it. There we go. Okay, bottom. 15. May want to wear some ear protection for this part. do it. New parts. I believe these are the right part numbers. These are the only bags I've got lying around. So one of these is the bottom rubber mount, top rubber mount, and big metal top mount itself. And then you look at here are the new pieces here, somewhat fitted together. There's the bracket part number. So this is the single new piece, top mount. Bottom mount. Keep that. Check that. You put in the bottom rubber bit, you just put it in, pull the tabs through to have it sit nicely. New one. The spring faces the rear. Find those holes and okay, just see them going through the bottom there. There's one here. It's coming through on that side. Just pull them right through until it snaps. There we go. There we go. Good. So you can see the end of the spring faces the rear. Faces the front. Spring faces the rear. This oval, the orientation should be front back.
I took it for, I reinstalled everything, put the wheels back on, went for a ride, and then what I noticed was the right spring was sitting exactly right in the middle of the seat, but I had a lot of trouble with the left one for whatever reason. And so what I've done, what you can imagine, is when you drop the lower control arm and place the spring inside and then jack the lower control arm back up, the spring has a tendency to slide outwards. So really all I've done is I've ratcheted, well, I've attached the springs to each other in an effort to pull the spring towards the middle. And then what I found was the spring was inclined to slide towards the rear, so I then took a second ratchet strap and attached it to the front of the spring and then ran it along the underside until I found a hole big enough and seemingly strong enough to support a little bit of tension, just to pull that spring forward a little bit. So you'll see now, really it's the bottom that counts. And right now the bottom looks pretty good. Of course the concern was it was coming out too far. So right now it looks great. So I'm gonna lift the spring back up with using my jack, and hopefully everything comes together nicely. Attention. I want to make sure this is lined up. There we go. Gets this close. Oh, shoot. That backfired, didn't it? There we go. Okay. Hook is in. What happens here is you get the bolt in, but then it's not aligned at the front, so you have to switch the jack over. And what you do is get the jack in underneath on the front side of the spring. So let it down, slide it around to the front and back it up a little bit, like that. So you're on the front side of the lower control arm where it's thickest. And then if you lift that up, you'll be able to align the bolt with the, well, let's see here. So really all I'm going to do is watch, lift it up. You see how the front of it is not aligned with the hole? So if you put the jack at the front of the control arm, you kind of slant it so that the lower control arm, the front of it comes up just so that you can align it with the bolt. Here we go. Let's try this out. Definitely not aligned yet. That's pretty darn close. Let's see. Works like a charm. Okay, you want to tighten these until the full weight of the vehicle is on the rear control arm. Sway bar back on, or sway bar link rather. Let's clean this up a little bit. Okay. 13. Don't forget the counter hold, also a 13. Let's put this on. Get it on there. Maybe a bit tight. It's not tight enough. That's probably good. That's it. Sway bar link's back on. You want to make sure this is sitting nice and tight up here, which it is. You want to make sure the top of the spring is pretty darn close to the indentation in the rubber bumper. And then at the bottom, obviously you want to make sure it's all sitting nicely. We're done. When you're reinstalling this lower bolt, don't torque it up. Leave it loose because you need to ratchet it back up to 110 Newton meters once the weight is back on the vehicle. The wheels, of course. I'm just going to put these on loose. to 1 or 2 foot-pounds when the wheel's back on the ground. Done.